Following the collapse of the Bronze Age palatial economies, we enter a period known as the Early Iron Age, meaning our area of focus really shifts into the exciting field of Homeric archaeology, which includes the epic tradition and, of course, Troy. My intention for this episode is to establish our period and the underpinnings of oral tradition. During the late Helladic III period, we saw the Mycenaean palaces flourish. The period of the late Bronze Age collapse corresponds roughly to the chronology of the late Helladic 3b phase of the Peloponnese, and by the time we reach the late Helladic 3c period, all the palaces have been abandoned, both on Crete and on the mainland. This marks the beginning of the traditionally termed Greek Dark Ages, the interim period around 1100 BCE, right after the Helladic 3c, is still sometimes classified as submycenaean, as there appears to be a small level of continuity. Even though the palaces are gone, the culture still seems to be mostly Bronze Age. For the successive periods of the Dark Age, we generally use a chronology based on pottery types, a system known as seriation and sequence dating that I mentioned before. Around 100 years later, about 1000 BC, we enter what's known as the Proto-Geometric Age, which is defined by a style of pottery led mostly by Athens. This early pottery is the first signs of a new emerging culture, and decoration of these pots is restricted to purely abstract and geometrical elements that usually include things like broad horizontal bands about the neck and the belly of the pot, or concentric circles applied with a compass and multiple brushes. By 900 BC, the proto-geometric has matured into what's known as the geometric age proper, and it's characterized by a successive series of early, middle, where we find the appearance of human forms especially, and late. Here, pottery makes use of geometric motifs in vase paintings that cover the entire ceramic. By around 700 BC, we enter what's known as the Archaic Age of Greece, where Homer begins writing. And archaeologically speaking, at least, things change very drastically after the 8th century. I should say that the terminology Greek Dark Ages is mostly being abandoned nowadays in favour of the term Early Iron Age for the period, largely due to the pejorative associations of the term Dark Age. Dark Age is also a historical term, not an archaeological one. It's based on texts. It's used by historians to denote periods where we have very little, if any, textual sources. But naturally, it implies a general downward turn in society where knowledge or skills are lost. Naturally, this implies a derogative that somehow the Greeks just became stupid or forgot how to do everything that they'd known how to do in the previous periods, like in the Mycenaeans. But actually, archaeologically speaking, that's very far from the case. It's certainly true that some elements are changed considerably, however, which require a little bit of explanation. Ian Morris, an archaeologist who is studying burials during this period, especially around Athens, has noted a spike in internments around 800 BC, but then it mostly falls off, which can give us a clue as to the number of people who lived in the area during different periods. One of the questions Morris's work raises is about the nature of burial. Who is allowed to have one, and who orchestrates it, and how well do they truly represent what's going on? People either disappear from the mainland, or the culture changes so drastically that they are not presenting themselves in the same way anymore, and it makes it very hard to discover anything archaeologically. We see this problem played out explicitly in settlements. Early Iron Age Knossos is a good example of this. Settlements that were used during the Bronze Age are, for the most part, abandoned during this period. And if they're in use at all, they are heavily reduced to small-scale villages that are mostly isolated and cut off. Urban settlements are always easier for us to find in the record in comparison to small country houses or highland settlements. Again, there could be the same amount of people just living in an entirely different way that doesn't leave archaeological traces as readily. Recent data from the Knossos Urban Landscape Project that I mentioned a few episodes ago did recover some pottery fragments from around Knossos, especially in the valley, that are theorised to date to the early Iron Age and arguably show a settlement size of around 5,000 people. which would necessitate some kind of social hierarchy and structure, but anything deeper than that is mostly unknown. We do, however, have some settlement evidence, which tells us that things are considerably different. Let's take a step back first and begin by going back to the late Bronze Age 3C period. So we're talking around 1200 to 1100 BC. This submycenaean phase has no active palaces. As I mentioned, the culture during this interim time still seems to be mostly Bronze Age. People are staying in the older sites during these 100 years, for example in Tirnis, in Argolis, that I mentioned in the last episode. During the late Bronze Age 3C, there are still people living in that lower town, and they appear to have built a building in the remains of the ruins of a recently destroyed palace there. While it's definitely not as sophisticated as the earlier palace, it is a potential signal that people are living and are trying to rebuild, but they're kind of failing. Moving over to Crete during this period, we see a noticeable movement of settlements into the hills and mountains. People are moving away from cities and other palatial compounds. There are competing theories over exactly what caused this influx of new sites to higher ground, but most common is an increase in violence and warfare, perhaps raiding, especially around coastal regions where a lot of the palaces were. A good example of these refuge sites is Kastri. It's right at the top of one of the highest mountains in Crete, and it's extremely difficult to get to. So people living there in a small-scale village must have had a very good reason to endure. Again, while invasion hypotheses are common, they often present more challenges than answers. Following an older generation of scholarship, mainly drawing from Herodotus, it was assumed that the main invaders, quote-unquote, were the Dorians, one of the four major ethnic groups that the later Hellenes divided themselves into. Dorians are referenced in texts as inhabiting Crete and hypothesized to be a Proto-Greek speaking population who brought the Greek language to the Peloponnese. With the discovery of Linear B, however, it was shown that ancient Greek was a descendant of the Mycenaean language that had been present in the region since the early Helladic period. So questions around whether the Dorians really constitute an invasion by a new culture or actually just a migration have arisen in recent archaeology. Typically, people argue for an invasion based on changes in style of pottery, architecture, or burials that replace an earlier period. The typical Dorian house style found at Nicolia, for example, begins becoming more popular during this period, and cremations with urns seem to overtake interments and burials. While there are certainly some interesting changes and things going on, such changes aren't uniform, and they don't cause a complete abandonment of earlier ages or styles of living, which again is not what we would expect from an entirely new culture that destroyed the old one. Instead, internal or migratory models fit the evidence much better, signalling that the society and culture is changing and probably just adapting to new environments and production styles, and they're finding new ways to be resilient, rather than being totally replaced or wiped out by some invading foreign culture who brought about all these changes. One of the major turning points for how we discuss and interpret the early Iron Age came with the excavation and publications of the site of Lefkandi on the island of Euboea. This site is incredibly important as its occupation is uninterrupted. It can be traced back to the early Bronze Age and continued throughout the Bronze and Iron Ages, only ending at the beginning of the Archaic period. In the middle of the site, a huge building was discovered, which throws a wrench in the image that every settlement during this 3C phase was just poor and isolated. In the 80s, this site garnered more attention when a large mound was discovered around the building that contained two very deep shaft graves. One housed the remains of a man and the other a woman. Both were buried with large horses over the top of the graves. While the male was cremated and had his ashes placed in a bronze crater or urn, the woman was buried and inhumed, so her body was preserved. Who were these people? The presence of horses in the grave obviously signals a great deal of wealth, and the woman was found wearing some high-quality ornate jewellery, including gold and a ring of electrum, along with a bronze brazier, and a garnet believed to have come from Babylonia. The man's ashes being inside a bronze urn also doesn't come cheap, and the container probably came from Cyprus. The urn was engraved with a hunting scene and placed within a larger bronze offering bowl, also known as a klater. Nearly everything we wouldn't expect during the early Iron Age is here at Lefkandi. A hierarchical and social elite expressing themselves differently to surrounding villages, with clear connections to other powerful people across the Aegean, being buried inside a grave inside an enormous building. Interestingly, that bronze crater in which the man's urn was placed was already 200 years old by the time it buried him. This kind of prestige good isn't uncommon. Even in Homer, we find the value of items or objects often being derived from their owners and then passed down through generations as exchanges between powerful people. What's even more interesting about this, however, is that a cemetery with other graves appears to have sprung up around this central gravesite. This phenomena, along with the fact that the original mound was found inside of a large building, has given rise to the theory that the shaft grave at Lefkandi is in fact an early form of Heroon, a shrine dedicated to local heroes. Not necessarily an ancestor cult, but a hero cult that became very popular in later periods and was designed to continue that heroic personality after death. The burials around these central graves are also comparatively wealthy, including scarabs from Egypt and ivory from the Middle East and Levant. What we're seeing in Lefkandi here is a community that is noticeably wealthier and has Eastern Mediterranean connections at the same time as the rest of the Aegean is really struggling. While Lefkandi is a relatively small settlement, this makes sense in a wider context. Euboean pottery appears all across the Eastern Mediterranean, and it was, in fact, on one of the first major export hubs in the entire regional trade network that I mentioned earlier. In other words, Euboea seems to have been very connected to the late Bronze Age palatial trade economy, and it doesn't seem to have stopped. Even during the late Bronze Age collapse, it seems to have been able to hold on to that power and prestige and some of its connections. As we move into the 8th century BC, we really begin to see some drastic changes in Greek culture. Between 800 and 700 BCE, we see an explosion in burials and graves as well as settlements, signalling that a lot of people are returning, or at least manifesting in the archaeological record. We begin seeing temple architecture reappear, as well as changes in art and pottery, making especially the emergence of the human form in Greek culture happen. More so than all of this, however, we see the emergence of new political identities forming, and the first traces of the later Greek concept of the polis can be traced to this period. While we see proto-policia around Knossos a little earlier, it's really during this early 8th century at sites like Gortyn, Athens and Eretria that we find traces of political identities being formed. The other major change that happens during the 8th century is, of course, the rediscovery and re-emergence of writing for the Greeks, albeit in a thoroughly transformed way. One of the earliest artifacts that gives us an insight into the development of Greek writing is the so-called Nestor's Cup, not to be confused with the Cup of Nestor found in Grave Circle A at Mycenaean. This 8th century wine cup was discovered in 1954 in the San Montano cemetery associated with the ancient trading site of Pithecusae in Magna Graecia. It contains 3 lines of inscription in an early form of Chalcidian and Eubaic Greek. It reads, "I am the cup of Nestor, good for drinking. Whoever drinks from this cup, desire for beautifully crowned Aphrodite will seize him instantly." While it's incomplete and damaged, this statement has been interpreted as one of the earliest evidence for communal wine drinking amongst men, in a social ritual that would later become known as the symposium during the classical period, of course famed by Plato. The inscription was added to the cup after its manufacture and is written from right to left, something that is unique among any known Greek art. The reference to Nestor and his cup is a well-known motif from Homer's Iliad and has been interpreted as referring to the poem. So at least some version of the Iliad was likely known by the artist or the carver. It's also no coincidence that Homer begins codifying the epic tales during this same time period. The alphabet used is a derivative of Phoenician, and it's nothing like Linear B, which signals the interconnectivity of the period and the extent to which the Greeks were familiar with foreign scripts and languages. From this moment forward, the Iliad and the Odyssey begin to tell us about people's concerns and desires during this period, and we will move into the epic tradition next week. So thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.